you want to get your thoughts on this. What racism have you experienced? How has it affected your life? And do you feel you've been held back because of the colour of your skin? You can give me a call and you can text me 81333. Start your text with Ed. And joining us now is Maurice Mcleod from Race on the Agenda, an anti-racist research and police policy, organisation working collaboratively to end racism in Britain. Maurice, good evening. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening.
Would you say it's fair to say you're sick and tired of the attention on individual instances of discrimination, and if so, why?
It's a good point. I kind of think I've got so much time and respect for John Barnes. I kind of think you need to do both. I think that it's not a surprise that when something happens to someone famous or, as John says, elite, that it gets more attention. That's sadly the world that we live in. If something happens to a celebrity or someone happens, in the public eye, we're going to notice it more. He's absolutely right to say that what matters is the structural stuff, and that, making sure that footballers can play without racism and making sure that people can get to, Oxford or Cambridge if they're clever enough is important, but it misses the vast majority of black people who aren't ever going to be playing football or get into Oxbridge. So he does make a good point. I think you need to do both, though, because if you ignore the stuff that happens to the elite play, if you ignore the bananas, if you ignore, the racism that some celebrities get, then, I actually think that that those incidents are a good way of talking about the stuff that happens to
It's about talking about it, but you mentioned structural, and I'm trying to get my head around it. And someone listening to us who hasn't come across the term structural inequalities, what do you mean by that? Think of something like employment, and then if you look at, we've been calling for organisations to publish an ethnicity pay gap. So when organisations started publishing the difference between what the women in their organisation and the men in their organisation were paid, people saw a gap and went, wow, this is bad, we need to fix it. We don't always have that information even about what the black people or Asian people in an organisation are paid against the white people. So that's a structural thing. It's not an individual boss going, oh, I don't like you because you're black. It's the nature of jobs that black people end up doing, or the nature of roles that Asian staff end up doing, are valued less and get paid less. So there's a structural thing at play, which is it's much harder to tackle. So I understand why we end up doing the easy stuff, going, oh, that person got stopped and that's terrible, or that person got a monkey noise. So it's deeper than what happens on a pitch. It's about people who are working, and for example, as you just rightly pointed out, black and Asian people not getting as paid the same as their white counterparts, and larger structural inequalities. Are they also being overlooked as well?
I'm afraid they are, to be honest. There's a lot of people making noise about them. So whether it's, in the criminal justice system, we can almost go through every stage of the criminal justice system, and you are at a disadvantage if you're black, so you're going to be stopped more. If you're stopped and found with something, you're going to be charged more. If you're charged, you're going to be sentenced longer. If you're sentenced, all the way along the line, there's a deficit from being black. That kind of thing is much harder it's easier to root out a bad apple and go, oh, that person did something bad, let's punish them or sack them or whatever. That's kind of easy to do. Unpicking a whole structure that's built up that sort of encourages, inequality, that's much harder to do. But unless we do that work, I'm afraid, 200 years' time, we're still going to be in the same sort of situation.
So you think more it's an institutional thing, which is it's kind of being discussed. We're talking about it now, but unless something is done to eradicate it, it will keep lingering.
Absolutely. And let's be honest, although we are talking about it now, let's not pretend that everybody's on board. The government itself published a report saying that actually there's no evidence of institutional racism. Actually, Britain's, the model country in terms of diversity, and everything's great. When you're black or Asian and you're not seeing that in your life, and you're hitting the barriers that we know exist, to be told that, hey, everything's all right, stop moaning. So I guess what I'm saying is it's not that we're all agreed and we're all pushing in the same direction. We still need to convince some people that there is actually a structural problem.
Sure. And
I wish we had a government representative here, but we don't, so we can't get their view. But I want to go back to what we've been talking about in terms of these structural inequalities. I wanted to get your personal take and to find out if you've been affected by it.
Yes, I would argue, and I know I've talked to many Black and Asian people who disagree with this, but I would argue it's very hard to exist in this country and not in some way have come up against those structures. So I was, as a young man, I was stopped 100 times by the police.
100 times?
Never done a crime. I just lived in I still live on a council estate, so I lived in an area where the police were active and were looking for people to stop. And so I got stopped very, very regularly. Now, is that structural? Did that affect me? It's probably impacted the way I think of the police, and it's affected my confidence. But the bigger things, I would say, are, I've been a journalist for nearly 30 years and watched my peers who I studied with, who are white and whatever, go on to amazing jobs. And some of them are in the biggest jobs in journalism. And you sort of go, ooh, okay, so I might be really bad. I might just not be as good as them. That's possible, of course. You need to not be a sort of psychopath about this. It might not be. It might be individual. It might be down to me. But when you look around at, I look at the other Black students on my course and go, yeah, there's undeniably something happening here. But it's very hard to prove. It's not an individual. It's not like one person sort of stopped me and that's what happened. And you can point to that bit. But you can go back to my career. Yeah,
clearly is a problem, and I'm sorry you experienced that. I mean, 100 times. I've never been stopped and searched.
Oh, amazing!
And for you to have been stopped 100 times, it's like no one wants to experience that, especially if you've done nothing wrong.
Yeah.
You mentioned living on a council estate, and John Barnes referred a lot to the racism that exists within the inner cities. I wanted to find out from you, what about the racism that exists out of that space?
So what do you mean, not in the inner cities?
Not in the inner cities, but sort of elsewhere.
Yeah, so the evidence, if you look at things like stop and search, for instance, or the the pay gap or incidents of hate crime, depending on even though a lot of focus is on London and the inner cities, because that's where large proportions of Black communities live, if you live somewhere rural where there are fewer Black people, sadly, you're even more likely to face some of these inequalities. You're even more, the gap between, stopping Black and white people is even bigger in these areas. And I suppose it's because maybe the police see, a Black guy and go, oh, what's he doing here in this leafy, lovely suburb? He shouldn't be here. And so there's sometimes even more problems.
So it's the perception that Black people are only allowed to live in the inner cities and they shouldn't live in sort of rural, suburban areas?
I'm afraid there is still that. We're in the second and third, fourth generations now since Windrush and things like that. So you would have thought things had moved on. I know lots of Black people have done really well and live in lovely houses in big leafy areas. So you would think it wouldn't still be such a thing. But all the stats, if you look at the stats from the police and you look at the stats from, health inequalities, for instance, we've just been through COVID. Sadly, it's still the case that wherever you live in the country, there's a deficit for having Black skin.
I'm mindful for time. I could keep you on the show all night to ask you a zillion questions, but I want to be frank here. Is racism still a massive issue? Because, John Barnes thinks it is, but as a society, we can point to instances where progress has been made. Yeah. And what progress do you think has been made?
I think it's important to point at progress because, I've been watching the Small Axe series again recently and looking at what was going on in the 70s and 80s. As much as I can say there's still big problems with the police, there's still big problems. I'm not likely to get beaten up by the National Front if I walk out of my door. I'm not likely to be spat at and called the N-word. That would be really, really, really rare, I think, especially in somewhere like London. It just, that sort of stuff has decreased. But then, if I'm honest, I'm not a hijab-wearing Muslim woman. Ask them whether they think that there's less racism on the streets these days. So sadly, there have been improvements. If you look at the fact that I'm talking to you now, there's people on radio shows, there's people on
We're getting more platforms on TV. There's more visibility, and not just. It used to be if you saw a black person, it was Crime Watch or it was Trevor McDonald on the news. That was literally it. Now that's not the case, and that's a good thing. And you know, with proximity, the cure for bigotry is proximity. So the more you see of people, the more you see black or Asian people and go, oh, they're just like us, the less of this problem there'll be, and we'll get there. But I'm afraid we're not quite there yet.
Let's hope we'll get there. Maurice, thank you very much for your time tonight. That's Maurice Mcleod from Race on the Agenda, an anti-racist research and policy organisation working collaboratively to end racism in Britain. You've heard what Maurice said there. A lot needs to be done. He was stopped 100 times by the police. What racism have you experienced? How has it affected your life? And do you feel at some point you've been held back because of the colour of your skin and your background? Let me know. Text me, 81333. Start your message with 3CR and you can give me a call as well.